Hi Math 1, this is Ms. Van Vickle with 3.4 Ready, Set, Go. I'm going to start by saying the ready part I'd like you to do by yourself. It asks you to talk about linear and exponential functions and make some comparisons between them. And I would like you to do that on your own, and then we can review that together in class. The set part, though, I want to talk about for just a little bit. It says for each of these graphs, you're supposed to identify the domain and range, and whether the function is increasing or decreasing. And I'd like us to take a look at graph 3 because there's an arrow right here, and that arrow feels a little confusing to me. Remember when we read graphs and we talk about intervals, we always talk going left to right across the graph. So I'm going to cover up this arrow just for a minute so it doesn't feel confusing. And I'm going to say if we went from left to right across this graph, we would notice that the y values start to get smaller. And here they get just a little bit smaller, but on this part of the graph they get a lot smaller. And that goes on all the way up until this point, which is a point at 4, -6. Okay, so it says identify the domain and range and whether or not the function is increasing, decreasing. I would have to say this is decreasing, because when I go left to right, my y values get smaller. Now let's take a look at domain. We know the domain ends at 4. Remember, in domain, I'm reporting out all of my x values, all the possible x values. And I know my domain ends at 4. But when I look over here, this says this graph goes on and becomes more and more and more and more negative, all the way to infinity. So I know my domain starts at -infinity. Now, I used a parenthesis here, not a square bracket, because we can never be equal to infinity. And I used a parenthesis here because that's an open dot. 4 is actually not in my domain. Everything up to the point of x being 4 is in my domain, but 4 is not. Now let's take it wants us to take a look at range, so let's take a look at range and let's see what you think. It looks like the lowest point on my graph is going to be -6, which is right here. And again, I'm going to use a parenthesis because that's an open dot. But when I go left to right on my graph, that's the lowest point. But when I look over here, when my graph is going all the way toward -infinity, what I notice is this is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It doesn't get bigger very fast, but it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's really hard to tell whether this continues to get bigger, which would be positive infinity, right? My y is getting bigger. Or if it kind of tapers off and just gets closer and closer and closer to -1. I think it's going to hug -1. As this graph approaches negative infinity, I think it's going to get close to -1. So the biggest y value is -1. And again, it's going to hug -1, but never equal -1. Now, if you assume that this graph is just going to keep growing as we move toward -infinity, you might have chosen to put a positive infinity as the y value of the range here. And that's just a matter of how you interpreted the graph. Let's take a look at number 2. It's a little more straightforward. If I look at this, it's decreasing. As I go left to right, it's getting smaller. So I have a decreasing function. If I look at domain and range, the smallest x value is -5. The biggest is 2. And I can't include that biggest because I have an open dot there. So that's my domain. My range is going to be what my y values are. So my biggest y value is this point right here. That's a y value of 5. My smallest y value is -6. So I'm going to say I go from -6 to 5. The -6 has an open bracket, a parenthesis, because that's an open dot. And the 5 has a square bracket because that's a closed dot. So give the others in the set portion of your homework a try. And you're going to have to make some assumptions about the functions, about whether they continue getting bigger right here, whether they continue bigger, or whether they just eventually even out. And that will affect what you choose for domains and ranges. On the go part, I think I cross this out as well. That's something we'll learn in another unit. So this is all for 3.4, Ready, Set, Go.